dress and behavior, in the knowledge that one day they would return to their homes in Europe or America and there invest their newfound fortunes. For certain minority groups, there would be a different outcome. Marble Hall was the home of a wealthy Armenian, Sir Paul Chater. He amassed an enormous fortune and left it to Hong Kong. The Kadoorie family, Jews from Baghdad, made their wealth and home here and today remain great benefactors. Parsis were some of the first traders to buy land in Hong Kong. Sir Thomas G. Modi was responsible for building the University of Hong Kong at his own expense. Religious and ethnic minorities who left their homelands and came to Hong Kong have left an astonishing legacy of development and philanthropy. But what of the Chinese who came to Hong Kong with the same ambition and will to succeed? For the majority, it was a life in a shantytown and work as a coolie. Immigration continued to rise. In the Chinese quarters, overcrowding and lack of sanitation were constant concerns. But when plague broke out, it was serious. The lives of Europeans were endangered, and the port of Hong Kong might be closed. The British administration intervened.
It was quite devastating because the plague flared up so suddenly. There were not enough medical officers, and so soldiers and policemen and so forth were recruited. And of course they hadn't a clue what they were supposed to do. I mean, they were just not trained for this kind of job. So on the one hand, the soldiers themselves felt very hard done by to have to expose themselves to this kind of epidemic. And on the other hand, the Chinese felt that they were being unfairly treated at the hands of people who really were not qualified to do the work they were doing.
No matter what, the Chinese population of Hong Kong kept rising, and gradually successful Chinese businessmen established homes here for the first time. However, age-old addictions to opium and gambling were a constant threat to success and security.
My great-grandfather lost several shops and houses in a Pai Gow game overnight. And as usual with rich Chinese in those days, he was an opium addict, but other than his opium addiction, he was fond of gambling. And it was the gambling in him and in my grandfather which brought down the family fortune.
Unlike China, Hong Kong had no scholar class who would have assumed natural leadership of the community. This left the Chinese merchants to undertake the role of local elite. The governor encouraged them to establish a Chinese hospital to provide care for the destitute. The Tung Hua Committee was the result. It was the first group to be recognized by the British administration as representatives of the Chinese community. Both British and Chinese were now aware that there was a serious need for education in the English language for the sons of the new elite. The central government school, later named Queen's College, provided the answer. It had the full support of prominent businessmen, both Chinese and Eurasian. The golden wedding party of Sir Robert Ho Tung attracted Hong Kong's high society. Sir Robert, a Eurasian, began life as comprador or chief agent to Jardine Matheson. An immense fortune followed, together with 4 houses on the Peak.
I had so many compradors in my family. They were sitting on top of the world. The Eurasians have the advantage of a better command of English, and therefore they were normally chosen as compradors. And being compradors, you have great opportunities of making millions of dollars.
Foreign merchant houses, banks and institutions all needed compradors to act as their agent, negotiator and chief of Chinese staff.
My father was a prominent member of society. He was a banker. He was a comprador. And there was a lot of entertainment. It was a family that was quite close, despite the fact that there were 12 of us.
And our house was so big that the lawn was so large that we used to fly kites there, ride our bikes on it. We had a Chinese drawing room, which was of all Chinese furniture, including opium diamonds and so on, and a Western European style drawing room. But I do remember that we were always included in all the dinners and all the teas, and they were always done on a very big scale.
As the end of the 19th century approached, Hong Kong residents were urging the extension of its colonial boundaries. Russia, France and Germany had all made claims in China, and rivalry was intense. To secure Britain's interest, she leased 390 square miles of Hong Kong's hinterland in 1898. The lease was for 99 years. The land acquired was clan land belonging to the Tangs and other smaller family groups. The treaty was signed in Beijing. The landowners of the new territories were never consulted.
I'm not surprised that the clans reacted very, very passionately, right? And I think we have to remember that in the new territories, many of these big clans were very well organized. They had a lot of wealth. They had a lot of education. And I think they were not going to take it lying down.
The clans gathered a force together and put up vigorous resistance. But the British military were better trained and better equipped. The raising of the flag was inevitable. At the official ceremony, Governor Blake read the terms of the treaty to the elders of the clans, which stated that land would not be expropriated except for public use, when it would be bought at a fair price. Hong Kong continued to see administrative and economic development in the early 20th century, but the aftermath of the First World War brought many changes. Britain no longer had a virtual monopoly of the Far Eastern trade. While Europe was suffering from unemployment and high taxation, Hong Kong's establishment enjoyed an Indian summer. In spite of the heat, ceremonial parades continued for visiting dignitaries. In China, revolution had overthrown the last Manchu emperor. The morality of imperialism was subject to question.
Colonial atmosphere was very heavy in Hong Kong. They were, the separated English was way up, and everybody was looked down on Chinese people. And the Chinese, at that time, the Chinese people actually do not find Hong Kong, they do not seem to belong to Hong Kong. They came to Hong Kong to do business, and then they went back to China. Everybody had a home in China.
The time was ripe for modern facilities attuned to Chinese business culture. The Bank of East Asia was founded by a group of highly educated young Chinese men, one of whom was Li Jiefeng.
Well, my grandfather told me that when he was a young man, he experienced difficulty in getting bank loans or bank financing when he started his business as a trader and also a ship owner. And he, together with a group of friends, decided to form this bank. The mission is not only to make money, but the mission is to throw off basically foreign dominance in the financial and economic field in Hong Kong.
The 20s saw the first signs of political and industrial tension. Strikes and boycotts inspired by the new revolutionaries in China brought Hong Kong to its knees. At the last moment, the boycott was called off and the port of Hong Kong was saved.
It was a trading post of considerable importance, but at the same time, life was very insular. It was not international to the extent of Shanghai.
Positioned at the mouth of the Yangtze River, Shanghai was the gateway to central China. Like Hong Kong, it had developed under foreign domination, but it had grown into a modern international city with an intriguing blend of East and West. It was a favorite destination for Hong Kong society.
Restaurants and cafes are crowded, and dancing to modern band music is the favorite pastime of Shanghai's cafe society.
Shanghai was the big city. It was the capital, as it were. Hong Kong was very much of a provincial town, small provincial town. I've often compared the two to Shanghai being London and Hong Kong being more like Hastings or Eastbourne at most.
The businessmen in Hong Kong did most of their business in the morning, dictated their letters. Then they went off to the Hong Kong club and had several gin and tonics, more than several sometimes. And afterwards they'd lie in long deck chairs or rattan chairs on the veranda, sleep it off, and go back in the afternoon and sign all their letters. And I think that was their day's work.
We had a very, very nice bungalow at North Point, which was country in those days, and a lovely sandy beach all along, and mat sheds if you wanted to go swimming. And then we had this priceless donkey, and we used to ride the donkey on the main road, much to the, I suppose, the anger or, I suppose, amusement of the tram drivers. They used to stamp their feet on the bell for the donkey to get out of the way.
Hong Kong's entertainment was mostly homegrown, but the racetrack in Happy Valley continued to provide the most popular distraction in the whole of Hong Kong's history. Fortunes might be won or lost, but in the 1930s the stock markets wiped out more than just the racegoers.
All my father, my uncles, they all went bankrupt. They all went bankrupt. And so in my case, it's from riches to rags. And that's why in those days I promised my mother, by hook or crook, I'm going to make good. I promise you I will become a millionaire again. And I became a millionaire in 1 year. With $10 in my pocket.
Despite world recession, Hong Kong's old colonial charm attracted a new sophisticated tourist industry in the late 1930s.
The Peak Cable Tram traveled to the top station, 1,300 feet above the sea, in 7 minutes. And inhabitants of the colony call this gliding climb a shortcut to fairyland.
Hong Kong's magnificent harbour was always the first sight that greeted the new arrivals. The tourists came in splendid cruise ships from Europe, and from America came a new form of luxury travel, the China Clippers. The Pan-American flying boats were pulled up to the quay. At Kai Tak Airport came the first Imperial Airways flights from England, a mere 11 days' journey. But as tourists explored the sights, the ominous shape of war loomed in the harbour. Japan had bombed Shanghai, and refugees were already pouring into Hong Kong. Tea dances at the Repulse Bay Lido were drawing to a close. The compulsory evacuation of European women and children to the Philippines and Australia took place in July 1940. Only nurses and women in essential services were allowed to stay. Volunteers from all walks of life offered to do what they could. The Japanese had been at the border for months, but it was not until November 1941 that Hong Kong believed that war was imminent. No amount of training could prepare the garrison for the Japanese attack when it finally came.
7:30 a.m. on December 8th. Our house had a very clear view of Kai Tak Airport, and I can remember vividly seeing the Japanese planes come over Kai Tak and wiping the place out in 5 minutes flat, and then turning on the radio as to what was going on. But we were constantly assured by the government and by the authorities of nothing to be afraid of. This is not serious.
The Japanese drove forward across the border and through the new territories within days. Despite heroic attempts by the troops involved, especially the local volunteers, the battle for Hong Kong lasted only 18 days.
The surrender took place, I remember, on Christmas Day, 1941. A few days later, we could then go out.
We walked back from town to Happy Valley and up the hill to the house. And all along the way on the slopes of the hills, I could see dead soldiers. Some with their stomachs blown open and some dead for days. And it was such a shock to us because we never expected to see a battleground on the way back to our home.
All surviving British, military and civilian, together with their allies, were rounded up and escorted to prison camp, where they would remain for the next 3.5 years.
The main interest there was to get food, whatever way. Our ration was 4 ounces of rice for breakfast in the morning. The next meal was about 7 o'clock in the evening, with another 4 ounces of rice and a teaspoonful of beans. Now and again, the Japanese got a brainstorm, and things like partridges would come in, but that was only because the cold storage had been bombed by the Americans, and they didn't know what to do with the partridges.
My father came out to Hong Kong in 1903, so he stayed and he got caught here, and we heard from him sort of at the very beginning of the captivity, but towards the end we heard nothing, so we naturally assumed the worst. Finally, I opened a newspaper on the tram going home, and there was this picture of my father in the internment camp with his homemade lathe, making wedding rings out of 10-cent coins and dollar coins or whatever he could find for the young ladies in the camp.
Life on the outside was equally hard for many. The fishermen of Tai O will never forget those years.
During
the Japanese invasion, we were very miserable, we fishermen. When we were out fishing, they burned our boat, killed our people, murdered them. It was the most miserable we have ever been.
We were down and out, except for a few sacks of rice in the house. We had nothing. But so in desperation, my mother went through family heirloom and found 4 opium pipes. And in those days, Japanese threw open the opium dens and the casinos, and my father took these opium pipes, who were beautiful sort of object art, and sold them in the opium den, and that raised about $1,000.
In 1945, when news broke that Japan had surrendered, a British flag was proudly hoisted. The British Navy arrived 2 weeks later. It had been a fortnight of speculation. President Roosevelt had wanted Hong Kong to be returned to China. Churchill, though out of power, wanted to preserve the colonies. As Japanese soldiers were relieved of their arms, Admiral Harcourt prepared to accept the surrender on behalf of Britain and China. General Okada signed the document on behalf of Japan and surrendered his sword. In the streets of Hong Kong, it was time for celebration. So many had died for Hong Kong. British, Canadian and Indian troops, local volunteers and heroic resistance fighters, as well as many civilians and prisoners of war. War is a great leveler. For Hong Kong, it helped to break down barriers between ethnic communities and introduced a new era of equality and unity. In the years since 1945, Hong Kong has grown dramatically. So much is owed to that rare combination of fine administration and extraordinary human endeavor. With the war behind them, the people of Hong Kong set about rebuilding the colony. Problems were monumental, but not insuperable. Food was imported, transport started to move again, and people began to return to the colony. Hong Kong's small industries were about to be overshadowed with the arrival of highly professional businessmen from Shanghai who feared a communist takeover in the mainland.
I was running the storage department in Cowley Wharf, and my head clerk said, there's a Shanghai gentleman would like to see you. And he came and he said, well, I intend to start a spinning factory. And I looked surprised and I said, but there's no water, there's no labor. He said, well, water doesn't really matter for spinning. But labor will bring it with us.
Shanghai's industrialists changed Hong Kong from a successful trading post to a sophisticated manufacturing center.
We spent almost 10 years to establish the name of Hong Kong. So after 10 years of efforts, success, so everybody accept our quality with world standard. That's, I think, I'm very happy to achieve this.
The arrival of the Shanghainese was just the beginning of immigration from China on a grand scale. As Chinese cities fell to the communists, Hong Kong was ill-prepared for the consequences. Beijing, October 1949. Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China. An historical event of international importance. For Hong Kong, it meant further pressure on its limited resources.
We were evacuating plane load after plane load. I mean, I think we were operating for maybe 3 weeks or more every day, at least one flight. And the flights went on until finally, the last flight, I went to Chongqing, and there were probably 100 people wanting to get on the plane, and 32 bucket seats. And I said, well, I'm not taking off unless, I mean, it's going to be one person per seat, and that's it. So I waited near the perimeter of the airport, and finally, people started to leave. So immediately got in and cranked up the engines and started to take off. And at this time, we could hear gunshot fires coming across the river.
Pressure mounted at Hong Kong's border. Families continued to pour in. Police and immigration officials were almost overwhelmed. To those that crossed into Hong Kong, a new life was dawning in a land that offered opportunity. The prospect of finding adequate accommodation, however, was remote. Families rented bed space where they could. A bunk per family was a luxury. For those without any connections, squatting on the hillside was the only answer. Homes were constructed from abandoned materials. Conditions were less than basic.
We stayed with our relatives at the beginning, sleeping in the hallway. The boys were sleeping out on the street. I had no work, so we had to take whatever we could get. We couldn't say no, even if it was a toilet hut.
The flimsy huts served not only as homes, but also as workshops. On Christmas Day 1953, a disastrous fire raged at Shek Kip Mei squatter camp. By morning, 50,000 people had lost their homes. Later that same day, the Hong Kong government committed itself to a serious resettlement program. Hillsides were flattened and land was reclaimed from the sea. Within 3 years, basic accommodation for 200,000 people had been built. The housing program grew annually, from resettlement blocks to low-cost housing estates. Today, the Housing Authority provides homes for over 3 million people, more than half of Hong Kong's population. Hong Kong's problem has always been the pressure of people, too many crammed into too small a space. In 1956, trouble erupted.
The Communists and the Nationalists were inclined to put up flags all over the place. And one of these resettlement areas, I think either Nationalist or Communist flag was stuck on the walls. And the resettlement supervisor ordered them to be pulled down, and that was the start of a riot.
Rioting continued for 4 days, and only when police resorted to gunfire was it brought under control. The 1956 riots were a prelude to the most disastrous decade Hong Kong had yet seen.
I think people forget really actually what happened in the 60s. But it was just one damn thing after another. There was a massive immigration from China, which was really like one of these great epic films with people tramping down over the hills in their thousands and pressing against our border fence and waiting till nightfall, and then they would all pull on the fence and pull it over and run into Hong Kong.
Typhoon Wanda swept in from the South China Sea and devastated Hong Kong. Many died. Great cargo ships ran aground and fishing boats were smashed to pieces. Despite the typhoon, a terrible drought plagued Hong Kong. Water was turned on once every 4 days and only for 4 hours at a time. Rumors spread of bank collapses, and worried depositors caused frantic runs on some of the local banks. Fearing for the safety of their money, they struggled desperately to withdraw their funds. A 5-cent fare increase on the Star Ferry was the start of another unexpected outcry.
It was an unpopular move. Our timing was lousy with hindsight, but it seemed such a tiny amount to put on the fare. But anyway, as events turned out, it was not very popular at all.
Rioting raged for nights. Looting and arson were expressions of social deprivation, but the damage was soon overshadowed by events in China. Mao's Cultural Revolution had stirred the political hearts of China's youth. Would this same passion reach Hong Kong and disrupt society, which had only recently recovered from such damaging riots? Outside Government House, 3,000 demonstrators chanted and waved their little red books. What started as orderly protest led to a frightening summer of random bombings.
Somebody put a bomb outside of my house. In those times, I was really scared because the house was so big and empty, just the two of us. My husband goes very early to hospital and comes back quite late.
The disturbances were the finest hour of the Hong Kong police. By the end of the year, the troubles were all but over. It was time to look forward.
Hong Kong's assets has always been its people, and the people of Hong Kong is well known to be resilient. Throughout the centuries, they learned to roll with the punches, and even when they're down and out, they never lose hope. They rise again and come again and fight another day.
From toy manufacturing to electrical goods, the people of Hong Kong emerged as an industrial force to be reckoned with. Local entrepreneurs grabbed every opportunity that presented itself, and rags to riches stories were commonplace. It was a golden age for Hong Kong. The people were hard-working, capable, and adaptable. As the world moved into the electronic age, Hong Kong was ahead of the game. Manufacturing growth had brought new life to Hong Kong shipping. The harbour was never busier. Then came the container revolution. Today, Hong Kong's container port is the largest in the world. With the huge expansion in the economy came the need for more land. The rural valleys of the new territories provided the source. Farming land was surrendered in return for a proportion of building land. As land prices rocketed, original settlers made profits. But their traditional way of life would never be the same. In the old rice paddies, containers now stand. Storage space is desperately needed. The ancient farmlands are providing the answer. In the hills, villages suffered a different fate. Their small rice crops couldn't compete with cheap bulk imports. Access to market was a long walk over the hills. It was time to go. All original settlers were eligible for British passports. Many took the opportunity and launched the Chinese takeaways of England and around the world. Events in Beijing in 1978 gave Hong Kong one of the greatest opportunities in its history. Deng Xiaoping announced China's open door policy.
Hong Kong, in a way, is very lucky. Strategically, we position right outside the doorstep of China. It's like and in 78 they declared the market open. They say we're going to have open market. It's like Herald sale, and we right outside the door doing business there. And people rushing in, and obviously we won the early birds, and we pick up some of the goodies.
The signing ceremony of a nuclear power station was the beginning of many joint ventures between China and Hong Kong.
China, with 1/4 of the world's population, represents an enormous potential. Not only is our location a fortunate one, but the timing is extremely important. And I believe in the next century, particularly, China will be a superpower and have a great role to play. And if we can assist in that, well, that's exactly why we're here.
In 1982, Mrs. Thatcher made her historic visit to Beijing to open negotiations regarding the end of the lease. Her fall on the steps was considered a bad omen. The stock market dropped dramatically. Hong Kong's confidence in the future was further shaken.
Oh, at that time we never thought that this would, the British would give up a colony back to China. Never thought of it. It never occurred to us.
The joint declaration was signed, whereby Hong Kong would be returned to China when the lease ran out, and in return China would maintain Hong Kong's social and economic systems for a further 50 years. Hope was restored. Hong Kong went into overdrive.
The 80s for Hong Kong, that was the big boom. Hong Kong women have become independently wealthy, and they dispense with their money very freely.
Joyce Ma has brought international style and fashion to Hong Kong's women, and the economic miracle has allowed them to indulge themselves.
Chinese women are very extravagant with themselves, especially in clothing. They are very, very elegant and fashionable, and they love to beautify themselves. And I do remember how the tailors would make Chinese cheongsams or their Western jackets and coats to coordinate with each outfit, and what with the different color piping on their clothes to make everything perfect.
The Indian community celebrates the golden wedding of one of their leaders. The Harilela family arrived in Hong Kong having lost everything in the 1930s depression. Together, they've rebuilt their fortunes and increased them spectacularly. Guests from across Hong Kong's communities gather to celebrate.
I like diversify. I always believed in diversifying. From men's tailoring, I went to ladies' tailoring. From ladies' tailoring, I went to real estate. From real estate to hotels. From hotels to finance. And then now we are in high tech.
This place is so tiny, and yet you find so many multimillionaires all over the place. It's because there's a special dynamic character about Hong Kong people.
Hong Kong's population has always been on the move. People have been coming and going since the days of the early settlers. Opportunities abound here for those that have the energy and the commitment. There's little time for people to stop and reflect. The events that took place in Tiananmen Square on June the 4th, 1989, threw Hong Kong into an unprecedented turmoil of emotion. Statue Square became a shrine. Thousands of people came to lay wreaths and pay their respects. A candlelight vigil was held in Victoria Park. Young and old came to share their grief. An overwhelming sense of sadness was shared by all. Despite their feelings, Hong Kong's people got on with their business and tried to look forward.
Hong Kong is a very fair and very equal society. You know, if you work hard, anyone can set up a business. There's no restriction on business. And anybody can try to do his own thing, and the government will give very little intervention. You know, we maintain the minimum law and order, minimum social benefit, minimum medical support. I think the cost on the society is low.
On an open rooftop, Mrs. Wong prepares her family's meal. Her husband is the building's caretaker. They're living in one room with their 5 children. There's no water, no drain, and no bathroom. But her children study hard and have ambitions to be doctors, policemen, or businesswomen.
If they sack my husband, we won't be able to stay here in this building. We will have nowhere to go. That is my biggest worry. Now it is very hard life, but by the time my children are grown up, I believe it will be better.
The belief that life will improve has sustained new arrivals for more than 150 years. The Dragon Range has been favorable to the people. The feng shui has been good. The peak has almost disappeared behind the encroaching high-rise. Through good times and bad, Hong Kong's harbour has remained a favorable anchorage.
We all feel that the management, the administration was good, was very good. The British, that was one thing that the British did very well in Hong Kong. They gave us a good, steady government so that we can work and, you know, and live here peacefully. And we appreciate that very much.
Since the days of the early settlers and the start of the Hong Kong story, many people have made this their home. Whether a British colony or a southern region of China, Hong Kong will never cease to be full of surprises.
Everyone has got to work out their own philosophy over Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a place which grows on you, or you hate it from the time you come here.
If China sincerely wanted to let Hong Kong govern itself as part of the one country, two systems, we would be really in for a wonderful next century.
Ever since the signing of the Joint Declaration in '84, we had decided we are for Hong Kong.
Well, I'll stay on and see what happens here. As far as property is concerned, I've been told I should sell, but I don't see why I should. What do I do if I sell?
I have confidence. I trust the Peking government.
I've always felt that the Chinese have everything to gain to have a very smooth takeover, and I am confident that that's the way it's going to turn out.
Whether the situation will change or not is unclear.
話唔俾啫，佢行恐嚇嘅咧。